Evelyn Harper did not cry when Superintendent Harold Graves slapped the dismissal letter onto her desk in front of every parent, every board member, and every student still sitting in their chairs. She read it once. She folded it in half. She looked Harold Graves directly in the eye and said, "You are going to regret this." He laughed. The board laughed. 3 of the mothers in the back row turned their faces away, like she was already gone. She was 27 years old, alone in Texas, and she had never been more certain of anything in her life. Before this story goes any further, if you are watching right now, and you love stories about real women who refuse to stay broken, please hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications so you never miss a single episode. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now settle in, because what happens next in Red Hollow, Texas, in the winter of 1892, is something you are going to be thinking about for a long, long time. The school board meeting that ended Evelyn Harper's career lasted exactly 11 minutes. She had been summoned without warning on a Tuesday morning, pulled from her classroom mid-lesson by the superintendent's assistant, a nervous little man named Fletcher, who wouldn't look her in the eye the entire walk across town. When she stepped inside the meeting hall and saw 7 men seated behind a long table with her personnel file already open in front of them, she understood immediately that this was not a conversation. It was a verdict. Harold Graves sat at the center, thick-fingered and red-faced, a man who had run Red Hollow's school board for 14 years without anyone having the courage to question a single one of his decisions. He cleared his throat, shuffled the papers in front of him, and didn't bother standing when she entered. "Miss Harper," he said, "take a seat." "I'll stand, thank you." His jaw tightened. "Suit yourself." He lifted one of the papers. "We've received complaints." "From whom?" "From parents, from community members, from people who have a vested interest in the moral character of this institution." Evelyn kept her hands folded in front of her. "I would like to hear the specific complaints, Mr. Graves." He looked at her over the paper like she had interrupted something important. "You've been allowing children of Mexican ranch families to attend regular classroom sessions. Those children live in this county. They have a legal right to education. They have a right to instruction appropriate to their station." He set the paper down. "That is not what you've been providing." "I've been providing reading, arithmetic, and basic science. The same curriculum for every student at this table, regardless of whose family they come from." A man at the far end of the table, Evelyn recognized him as Alderman Fitch, who owned the largest cattle operation east of town, leaned forward with a look that was almost amused. "You've also been running lessons after hours for children who can't afford tuition. Miss Harper, without authorization, without compensation to the board." "I was using my own time." "You were using the school's building," Fitch said. "The board's building, and you were doing it without permission. I asked for permission in September. I was told the matter would be discussed. It never was." Graves cut back in. "Additionally, there are concerns about the nature of your instruction for female students. Several families have reported that you've been encouraging girls toward ambitions that are," he paused, selecting the word carefully, "unsuitable. I taught them that they are capable of more than they've been told they are. If that's unsuitable, then I accept the label." The room went quiet for a moment. Then Graves reached into the file and pulled out the dismissal letter already signed by all 7 board members. He slid it across the table toward her. "Your contract is terminated effective today, Miss Harper. We expect you to clear your belongings from the classroom before 3 o'clock and vacate the school-provided lodging by Friday morning." Evelyn looked at the letter. She looked at each of the 7 faces behind that table, some of them tight with righteousness, 1 or 2 of them unable to hold her gaze, and she understood in that moment that there was nothing left to argue, not because she was wrong, but because being right had never once been the point. She picked up the letter. She folded it. She looked at Harold Graves and said very quietly, "You are going to regret this." Then she walked out. She did not cry until she was back in the classroom alone, surrounded by the small desks and chalk-dusted boards and the little paper drawings her students had hung along the window ledge. She sat in her teacher's chair, pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, and let herself have exactly 3 minutes of grief. Then she stood up, rolled up her sleeves, and started packing. By 2 in the afternoon, she had her trunk at the train station. The next eastbound train wasn't until midnight. She had 7 hours, $11, and no plan beyond getting as far from Red Hollow, Texas, as 7 hours and $11 could take her. She sat on the wooden bench outside the station and watched the town move around her like she had already left. Women she had taught alongside at Sunday school walked past without stopping. The grocer's wife crossed to the other side of the street before reaching her. A group of older men standing outside the telegraph office glanced her way, said something to each other, and then went back to their conversation. Fletcher, the superintendent's assistant, was the only person who stopped. He stood a few feet away, hat in his hands, and said, "Miss Harper, I'm real sorry about how it went." "Are you?" "Yes, ma'am, for what it's worth." "It isn't worth much, Fletcher, but thank you for saying it." She looked at him steadily. "Are any of the children I taught in those evening sessions going to continue their education?" He looked at the ground. "I don't rightly know." "No," she said. "Neither do I." She turned back toward the empty street. "That's the part I mind most." He put his hat back on and walked away. She sat there for another hour. The sun dropped behind the ridge, and the air turned cold fast the way Texas air did in November, cutting right through the wool of her coat. She pulled her traveling bag closer and watched lanterns come on one by one in the windows across the street, and she thought about Boston, about her mother's kitchen, and the smell of bread and the sound of carriages on cobblestone, and she wondered what it said about her, that after everything, the thing she felt most was not sorrow, but a cold and quiet anger that had nowhere left to go. She heard his boots on the platform before she saw him. Not hurrying, not slow either. Just purposeful, the way a man walked when he'd decided something and wasn't reconsidering. She didn't look up at first. She assumed it was the station master coming to tell her the train was delayed. But the boots stopped about 4 feet away from her, and no one spoke. And when the silence stretched long enough that it had become unusual, she finally raised her eyes. He was tall. Not in the theatrical, broad-shouldered way of men who wanted you to notice they were tall, but in a quiet, worn-down way, like a fence post that had survived a decade of weather and come out the other side stripped of everything unnecessary. He wore a dark hat with the brim pulled low, a canvas jacket that had seen hard use, and the kind of boots that told you their owner spent more hours in a stirrup than on solid ground. His face was angular, sun-weathered, the jaw darkened with several days of unshaved growth, and his eyes, when he finally tipped his hat back so she could see them, were a dark, tired gray, the kind of eyes that had looked at too many difficult things and learned to hold very still in response. He was holding his hat in both hands in front of him. That surprised her. Men in Red Hollow didn't take their hats off for women they didn't think warranted the gesture. "Miss Harper," he said. His voice was low and unhurried the way certain Western men spoke when they'd spent years in the company of animals and open land and had learned that most things worth saying didn't need rushing. "Yes," she said. "And you are?" "Caleb Turner. I got a spread about 4 miles northeast of town." He paused. "You probably heard of me." She had, actually. The name circulated in Red Hollow the way names of solitary, vaguely feared men tended to circulate in small towns, not as gossip exactly, but as a kind of shorthand. Turner's Ranch. The widower. Keeps to himself. Don't cross him. She'd never seen him in church, never seen him at any of the social functions the town organized, never seen him anywhere except once at the general store, when he'd been loading supplies into a wagon bed with the efficiency of a man completing a task he wanted finished as fast as possible. "I've heard the name," she said carefully. He nodded, like that was exactly what he'd expected. "I heard what happened at the school board this morning. Word travels fast. It's a small town." He turned his hat once in his hands. "I want to ask you something, Miss Harper, and I need you to hear me out before you answer." She studied him. He wasn't looking at her the way most men looked at a woman sitting alone on a train platform in the dark, that combination of evaluation and mild contempt that she had learned to identify and brace against. He was looking at her the way someone looked at a person they were trying to judge fairly, which was a different thing entirely. "All right," she said. I need a teacher, not for children." He stopped. Something shifted slightly in his face. A tightening that she understood instinctively was not comfortable for him. "For me, there are gaps in my education that have caused me problems. Business problems. And I don't have the—" He stopped again. "I need to be able to handle my own correspondence and my own contracts without asking someone else to do it for me. And I need to learn how to do that without the whole county knowing it's something I can't already do." She understood immediately what he was saying, and also what he was not quite saying. "How serious are the gaps?" she asked. He held her gaze without flinching. "Serious enough that I rode into town tonight to find a dismissed school teacher and ask for her help before she got on a train and left. That answer your question?" She was quiet for a moment. The lantern at the end of the platform swayed slightly in the wind. "And in exchange," she said, "room and board through winter. The ranch house has a separate room. It's modest, but it's warm, and it's private. You'd have your meals, your firewood, whatever you need for supplies, and I'd pay you." He named a figure that was not extravagant, but was considerably more than her teaching salary had been. "When spring comes, and you want to leave, you leave. No obligation beyond that." She looked down at her trunk sitting beside the bench. "Mr. Turner," she said slowly, "you understand that I was just fired for behavior that this town has decided is immoral. Having me come live on your property, even in a separate room, even for a legitimate purpose, will not do your reputation any favors." "My reputation in this town," he said, "was fixed a long time ago, and not in my favor. I don't spend much time worrying about it. People will talk. People always talk. The question is whether you care enough about what they say to stay cold on a train platform all night, waiting for a ride back to a city where you'll have to start over from nothing." He put his hat back on his head. "I'm not telling you what to decide. I'm just telling you there's another option." She looked at him for a long moment. She was good at reading people. It was one of the things that had made her a decent teacher, and what she read in Caleb Turner was not easy to sort out cleanly. He was guarded in the way that people became guarded when they'd been hurt in ways they didn't know how to talk about. He was proud in the way that made the asking of a thing like this enormously costly to him. And he was honest, or at least presenting himself that way in a town where honest had been a relatively rare commodity in her experience. "Who else knows you're here?" she asked. "Nobody. I told nobody." He paused. "That was intentional. And if I say no, then you say no, and I ride back out, and you get on your train, and that's the end of it." He shrugged one shoulder minimal. "No harm done." She stood up from this bench, and her knees ached from sitting in the cold for hours, and she pressed her hand briefly to her lower back, and looked out at the dark street beyond the station. Red Hollow in the nighttime looked like every small western town she'd ever seen shuddered, and certain of itself, the kind of place that had decided what it was and what it wasn't, and was deeply resistant to any suggestion that either conclusion could be revisited. She had come here 18 months ago with a trunk full of books and the genuine belief that a classroom was a classroom, regardless of what state or county it sat in, that children were children, regardless of what their fathers did for work or what country their grandparents had come from, and that the job of a teacher was to give every student in the room the best version of what she had to offer. Not a tiered version calibrated to the expectations of 7 men sitting behind a table. And they had taken that belief and used it as the instrument of her destruction. She thought about the faces of her students. Rosa Mendez, who at 11 had the fastest mind for mathematics Evelyn had ever encountered in a classroom. Little James Whitfield, son of the county's poorest sharecropper, who had memorized 3 poems by Christmas of his first year. Margaret Crane, 14, who had told Evelyn in quiet confidence that she wanted to be a doctor someday, and whose mother had been in the back row at the school board meeting that morning without once speaking up on Evelyn's behalf. She thought about all of them. And then she thought about the train ticket in her coat pocket, and the city at the other end of it, and the starting over from nothing that waited for her there. She turned back to Caleb Turner. "I have conditions," she said. Something in his face changed very slightly. Not relief, He wasn't a man who would allow himself to show relief, but a loosening, the faintest loosening around the eyes. "All right," he said. "The arrangement is professional. That is fixed and not subject to discussion or renegotiation at any point." Agreed. I set the pace of instruction. I don't take orders on how to teach, and I don't skip steps because the student is impatient or embarrassed. We go at the rate that produces actual learning, not the rate that feels comfortable. His jaw moved. Agreed. And I will need access to a workspace. Somewhere private with a table and decent light where I can organize materials and prepare lessons without interruption. You can use the front room evenings. It's yours after supper. She held out her hand. He looked at it for a second, and she saw something cross his face. Surprise, maybe? Or a kind of recognition. And then he took it. His grip was firm, and his hand was rough in the way of a man who had done hard physical labor for most of his adult life, and he held the handshake for exactly the right amount of time, and then released it. "I'll get your trunk," he said. "I can manage. Miss Harper." He said it evenly, not with condescension, just with clarity. "It's heavy, and it's cold, and my wagon is 20 feet away. Let me get your trunk." She let him get the trunk. He loaded it into the wagon without visible effort, and she climbed up to the bench seat, and he came around the other side and took up the reins, and they drove out of Red Hollow in silence, the town's lamplit windows falling away behind them one by one, until there was only the open Texas dark, and the sound of hooves on hard-packed dirt road, and the stars overhead enormous and indifferent, the way stars always were in country, this flat and this wide. Neither of them spoke for a quarter mile. Then Evelyn said, "How long has it been a problem, the reading?" He kept his eyes on the road. His hands were steady on the reins. "Since always," he said. "Some things I worked around. Letters I hired a man to read correspondence, and I paid him enough to keep quiet about it. Contracts I managed by listening more than most people do, and asking for time to review that I didn't always use honestly. But since my wife passed..." He stopped. "There's nobody I trust now, and I can't run a ranch on trust anyway. I need to be able to read what I'm signing. How long ago did your wife pass?" A beat of silence. Not hostile, just waited. 4 years, he said. She died in childbed. The child with her. Evelyn did not say she was sorry. She had learned over years of dealing with grief in students' families that the rote expression of sympathy often served the speaker more than it served the person receiving it. Instead, she said, "That's a long time to carry something that heavy alone." He didn't respond to that, but his hands shifted slightly on the reins, and she noted it. The wagon rolled on through the dark. "What's your wife's name?" Evelyn asked. He glanced at her sideways. Was. She corrected herself quietly. "Clara," he said. Then, after a pause, "She was the one who handled all the paper business. She liked it. Had a good hand for figures, too." He paused again. "I knew when I married her that she was sharper than me in that way. I didn't mind it then. I mind it now that she's not here to do it." "You mind that she's gone," Evelyn said. "Not that you need the help." He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said finally. "That's more accurate." Somewhere in the far distance, a coyote called, and then another answered it, and the horses' ears swiveled, but their stride didn't break, and the dark road stretched out ahead of them, and the lights of Red Hollow were entirely gone now, and the only warmth in the world seemed to be the faint amber glow coming from the windows of the ranch house, slowly growing larger at the end of the lane. "Mr. Turner," Evelyn said. Caleb, what made you come to the station tonight?" You could have asked any number of tutors from the county. Why a dismissed teacher with a reputation like mine? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Because a teacher the town is afraid of is a teacher who is doing something real. And I don't need someone who teaches what's safe. I need someone who teaches what's true." He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the ranch house and set the brake. "The way I figure it, Miss Harper, you're the only honest person Red Hollow has had in a schoolroom in 20 years, and they just made the mistake of running you off. That makes you exactly the kind of teacher I need." He climbed down from the wagon and came aside and offered his hand to help her down, and she took it, and when her feet were on the ground, she looked up at the house, plain and weathered and solid, in the way of structures built to last rather than to impress, and she breathed in the cold night air and thought about all the things she had lost in the last 12 hours, and all the things she had no idea yet that she was about to find. "I should tell you something, Caleb," she said. He waited. "I am an extremely demanding teacher," she said. "I have very little patience for excuses, and no patience at all for the kind of pride that stops a student from asking for help when they need it. If we're going to do this, we do it honestly, which means when you don't understand something, you say so. And when I push you harder than feels comfortable, you push back through it instead of shutting down." She looked at him levelly. "Are you prepared for that?" The quiet stretched between them for a moment, and then for the first time since she'd met him an hour ago on the train platform, something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one, the shadow of something that had been buried a long time and was not yet ready to emerge fully, but had apparently recognized in the bright cold precision of her words something worth responding to. "Miss Harper," he said, "I roped my first steer at 12 years old, built this house by hand at 22, and buried my wife and child on the same day at 31. I reckon I can handle a demanding teacher." She studied him for one more moment. "We'll see," she said, and turned and walked toward the front door of the ranch house, where a lamp burned in the window, steady and warm against the Texas dark. The ranch house was exactly what the outside suggested, built by a man who understood function and had no interest in pretending otherwise. The front room held a stone fireplace, 2 chairs worn smooth with years of use, a table that had clearly served as both a dining surface and a workspace, and a wooden shelf along one wall that held not books but tools, a coil of rope, a tin box, a stack of folded papers held together with twine, a lantern, and a single Bible with a cracked leather cover that someone had set there a long time ago and not moved since. No books, not one. Evelyn noticed that the way you notice the absence of something essential, the way a doctor noticed the absence of color in a patient's face, not as a judgment, but as information she needed in order to understand the full scope of what she was dealing with. Caleb set her trunk down near the door of the smaller back room and straightened up. "It's not much," he said, "but the bed's solid and the stove in there works. I'll get more wood in the morning." "It's fine," she said. She was looking at the shelf. He followed her gaze. She saw something move through his expression, a bracing, the kind a man did when he was about to be seen doing something he hadn't consented to, and then he crossed to the shelf and turned the Bible face down in a motion so practiced it was almost reflexive. She didn't comment on it. "I'll start a fire," he said. "I can manage a fire. Miss Harper." The same quiet steadiness he'd used at the station. "Sit down. You've had a long day." She sat down. He built the fire in about 4 minutes, economical and competent, and then stood and brushed his hands on his trousers. "I eat at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening. You're welcome to eat when you like. There's bread and salt pork in the kitchen." He paused. "I'll need to let the hands know we have a guest. I've got 2 men who work the cattle hector and a boy named Walt. They mind their own business." "When would you like to start?" she asked. He looked at her. "Lessons," she said. "We may as well establish a schedule tonight so neither of us wastes time wondering about it tomorrow." He was quiet for a moment. "Evening, I suppose, after the day's work is done." "Mornings are better for retention," she said. "The mind is fresher. If your work permits, I'd suggest an hour before the day starts and another hour after supper. The morning session for reading and writing. The evening session for whatever else needs addressing: correspondence, contracts, figures." Something flickered behind his eyes. Not resistance exactly. More like a man recalculating the cost of a thing he'd already agreed to purchase. "All right," he said finally. 6:30 mornings then." She nodded. 6:30. He went to his room. She sat by the fire for a while longer and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling around her, the occasional shift of horses in the barn, the wind against the shutters, the small creak of the house in the cold, and she thought about what he'd said in the wagon. That she was the only honest person Red Hollow had put in a schoolroom in 20 years. She thought about that for a long time before she slept. The first morning lesson started the way all first lessons started, with the truth. She put a sheet of paper on the table in front of him, laid a pencil beside it, and said, "Write your name." He picked up the pencil. He set it down. He picked it up again. And then, with the slow deliberateness of a man performing surgery on himself, he wrote, not exactly wrote, but constructed letter by careful letter, CALEBTURNER. It took him 40 seconds. Every letter was legible but effortful. The hand pressure uneven, the spacing irregular, the letters the size of a child's first attempt. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Good. Now read me what you wrote." He looked at the paper. His jaw tightened. "Caleb Turner," he said in the flat voice of someone reciting from memory rather than reading. "Point to each word as you say it." He pointed. His finger hesitated over Turner for a fraction of a second too long. "All right," she said. She slid the paper aside and replaced it with a fresh sheet. "I'm going to write a sentence. I want you to tell me every word you recognize." She wrote, "The cattle need water before noon." He leaned forward and studied it. His breathing changed. She could hear it, the slight constriction that came when a person was working harder than they wanted to let on. He pointed to "That one," he said. And his finger moved. "Water." Another pause. "Noon?" "Cattle," she said. "Do you know that word?" He shook his head once tight. "Need before." He looked at the words. He shook his head again. She had taught children who struggled with reading. She had taught adults who had come to literacy late through no fault of their own. She knew what it looked like, the particular combination of effort and shame that lived in the body of someone who had spent years hiding the fact that the written world was largely closed to them. She had never once believed that difficulty with reading reflected anything about the quality of a mind. But she also knew that knowing that intellectually did absolutely nothing to reduce the shame the person sitting across the table was feeling right now. "Caleb," she said. He looked at her. "I need to understand something before we go any further. The letters, do you know all of them? Can you identify them individually?" A long pause. "Most of them." "Which ones give you trouble?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he stood up abruptly and walked to the window and stood with his back to her and his hand on the frame, and he said very low, "B and D, P and Q, sometimes G and C. When they're in the middle of a word, I lose them." He turned around. His face was hard and controlled, but his eyes were doing something different. "I've known that since I was 8 years old. I just got very good at working around it." She held his gaze steadily. "Those letter confusions have a name," she said. "It doesn't mean your mind is slow. It means the way you see letters is different from how most people see them, and it's something we can work with directly." She paused. "How much of that did the teachers in your childhood address?" He let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "The teachers in my childhood called it stupidity and moved on." She kept her face neutral and her voice level. "They were wrong," she said, "and we're going to prove that starting this morning." She picked up the pencil. "Sit down. We're going to start with B and D, and we're not going to leave them until they're fixed in your mind permanently." He came back to the table. He sat down. He did not say thank you, and she did not expect him to, because gratitude at this stage would have meant lowering a wall he needed to keep up in order to function. And she respected that. She understood walls. She'd built a few herself. They worked for an hour. At the end of it, he could distinguish B from D 9 times out of 10 without hesitation. And when he got the 10th one right, he set the pencil down and sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment, in a way that was so much like a man trying to contain something too large for the space available, that she looked deliberately at her own notes to give him the privacy of it. "Same time tomorrow," she said. He cleared his throat. "Same time tomorrow," he agreed. She was organizing her materials when Hector came to the door, a broad-shouldered Mexican man, about 40, weathered and careful in the way of someone who had learned that being careful was a form of self-preservation. He had brought word that a rider had come from town for Mr. Turner, left at the fence post, since nobody had answered when he knocked. Caleb took the letter. He turned it over once. He set it on the table without opening it. After Hector left, Evelyn looked at the envelope. It was sealed with red wax and bore the return stamp of a law firm, Alderman and Fitch Attorneys at Law Red Hollow, Texas. "That's from Fitch," she said. "The alderman on the school board." Caleb looked at it like it was a thing that might move on its own. "How long has he been sending you letters?" she asked. Something shifted in his face. "That's the fourth one this year," he said quietly. "I had the first 3 read to me by a man I trusted. After that He stopped. "After that I found out the man wasn't entirely trustworthy. So the last one I didn't have read at all." She looked at him. "Caleb, how long ago was the last one?" "September. It was November." "May I?" she asked, and nodded at the letter. His jaw worked. He pushed it across the table. She broke the seal. She read. And the further she read, the more carefully she kept her expression neutral, because what was on those pages was not a courtesy letter, and it was not a routine business communication, and it was not anything that a man could afford to have sitting unopened on his table for 2 months. Fitch and his partners were filing a legal claim on the northeastern quarter of the Turner ranch land. The basis of the claim was a disputed boundary survey from 1887. The response deadline was December the 1st. That was 19 days from now. She set the letter down. "Tell me," Caleb said. His voice was very quiet. She told him. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she'd heard since stepping off the train in Red Hollow 18 months ago. Caleb sat absolutely still for a long moment, and then he pressed both palms flat on the table and breathed out slowly through his nose, and she watched him absorb the blow the way a man absorbed a physical impact by bracing and refusing to go down. "That quarter section," he said finally. "That's where the main water source runs. You lose that land, you lose reliable water access for the whole herd." "Yes," she said. "I understand. If the herd can't water properly, the ranch doesn't run. And if the ranch doesn't run—" He stopped. He looked at her. And she saw in his face something she hadn't seen yet. Not shame, not grief, not the controlled blankness he used as a social shield, but a raw and genuine fear. The fear of a man watching everything he'd worked for and everything he'd survived begin to come apart at once. "There are 2 earlier letters in the stack on that shelf," she said. "I need to read them. I need to understand the full sequence of what Fitch has been building before we can assess what options exist." He was quiet. "Caleb." She said it the way she said students' names when she needed them to come back to themselves from wherever fear had taken them. Level. Present. Without condescension. "This is fixable. Legal claims have response processes. There are deadlines, which means there is still time. But I need to read everything, and I need you to tell me everything you know about that boundary survey, and everything you know about your relationship with Fitch going back as far as it goes. Can you do that?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he stood up, went to the shelf, took down the tin box, brought it to the table, and opened it. Inside were letters, folded documents, a tax notice from 1890, and 3 envelopes from Alderman and Fitch Attorneys at Law. "I'll get coffee," he said. She was already reading. The letters laid out a pattern that made her stomach harden by the 3rd page. Not an impulsive land grab, but a carefully constructed legal maneuver that had been building for at least 2 years, incrementally. Repositioning the boundary dispute through paper filings and strategic delays, exploiting the fact that the man who owned the land couldn't fully read the documents being used against him. It was sophisticated. It was deliberate. And it was the kind of thing that could only work against a target who couldn't read his own mail. Caleb set a mug in front of her. He sat down across the table. He watched her face as she read, and she knew he was reading her expression, the way a man read weather looking for signs of how bad the storm was going to be. When she finished the 3rd letter, she set it down and wrapped both hands around her mug. "How well do you know the preacher?" she asked. He frowned. Reverend Alcott. Not well. Why? Because Alcott's name appears as a witness signature on the 1887 survey document that Fitch is using as the basis for the boundary dispute. And based on what I'm reading, that survey was conducted at a time when you were still managing your wife's final illness and had no way to supervise or contest it. She looked at him steadily. You were being set up before you even knew there was a game. He said something under his breath that was not appropriate for polite company, and under the circumstances, she had absolutely no objection to it. Who do you trust in this county? She asked. Not acquaintances. Who do you genuinely trust? He thought. Hector, he said. And Doc Perkins, maybe. Doc has no stake in the land fights. Is there a lawyer in the county who doesn't have a financial relationship with Fitch? Another silence, longer this time. There might be one in Abilene. Then we need to get a letter to Abilene by the end of this week. She looked at him directly. And you're going to write it yourself. He stared at her. I can barely write my own name. You wrote your name this morning in 40 seconds, and 9 of your 10 letters were correctly formed. In 4 days I can teach you enough to draft the bones of a letter. I'll help you with the rest. She held his gaze. This matters, Caleb. A letter from your own hand in your own words, requesting legal representation against a land fraud scheme that is a different document than anything I write for you. It establishes your voice. It establishes your competence. And it tells whoever reads it that you are not the man Fitch has been counting on you to be. The fire in the hearth crackled. Outside, the wind was picking up, pressing against the walls of the house with the quiet insistence of Texas weather announcing its intentions. Caleb Turner looked at the stack of letters that had been quietly dismantling his life for 2 years, while he sat 20 feet away, unable to read them. And something in his face changed. Not the polished, complicated expression of a man recalibrating, but something rawer and older and harder to name. The look of a person who had just clearly identified the thing they were fighting and found beneath the fear something that felt almost like relief. All right, he said. Teach me. They worked for 4 days straight, without a single day of rest between them, and by the end of the 2nd day, Evelyn had stopped thinking of the sessions as lessons in the conventional sense, and started thinking of them as something closer to excavation, the slow, careful removal of years of debris from around a mind that had always been capable and had simply never been given the right tools. Caleb was not an easy student. He was impatient with himself in the particular way of people who had spent decades performing competence they didn't fully possess. And every time his hand formed a letter incorrectly, or his eye skipped a word on the page, his jaw went tight, and his breathing changed, and she could see him calculating whether the effort was worth the exposure. She gave him no room to retreat into that calculation. Every time she saw it happening, she put another sentence in front of him and said, again, and watched him push through the wall of it, because the alternative, Fitch taking his land, the cattle losing water, the ranch coming apart at the seams, was more intolerable than the embarrassment. On the 3rd morning, he wrote the word cattle without hesitating over any of the letters. He stared at it on the page for a moment. Then he said, again, like he expected her to tell him he'd done it wrong. Again, she said, but she was smiling, and he saw it, and something in his posture shifted in a way she hadn't seen before. Not relaxed exactly, but less braced, the way a man stood when a storm he'd been tracking turned direction and passed without landing. He wrote it again, faster, clean. That's yours now, she said. That word belongs to you. He looked at her across the table. Just the one word. Today. Tomorrow it'll be 2 more. The day after 10 more. That's how this works. She slid the next page toward him. Now read me this sentence. By the 4th evening, the letter to Abilene was taking shape, and what Caleb Turner was producing in his own handwriting, with his own deliberate and increasingly steady hand, was not polished. And it was not elegant, but it was clear, and it was specific, and it laid out the facts of the boundary dispute and Fitch's conduct with a directness that needed no ornament. When he read the last line back to her aloud, his voice was level, but his hand on the page had gone very still. Is it enough? He asked. It's more than enough, she said. It tells a lawyer exactly what he needs to know, and it tells him in your voice. That matters." She paused. "Sign it." He signed it. He looked at his name at the bottom of the page. Not the 40-second construction of that first morning, but something written with authority, with intention, and she gave him that moment without interrupting it, because he had earned it completely. The letter went out with Hector early the next morning before Red Hollow was awake. The churchwomen came that same afternoon. There were 3 of them: Mrs. Alderton, who was the Reverend's wife; Mrs. Crane, whose daughter Margaret Evelyn had been teaching before the dismissal; and a woman named Dolores Hatch, who had no particular official standing, but whose opinion in Red Hollow carried the weight of several official bodies combined. They arrived in a buggy unannounced and knocked on the ranch house door while Caleb was out at the barn with Walt and Hector. Evelyn opened the door. The 3 women looked at her. She looked back at them. "Miss Harper," Mrs. Alderton said, in the tone of someone who had prepared this opening and was committed to delivering it as planned. "We've come as a courtesy. There is concern in the community about the current arrangement here at the Turner property." "Come in," Evelyn said, and stepped back from the door. They came in. They looked at the table covered in writing papers and pencils and letter drafts and the open primer she'd been using with Caleb. Mrs. Crane looked at the Bible on the shelf still face down where Caleb had turned it weeks ago. "We want to be clear," Mrs. Alderton continued, "that we bear you no personal ill will, Miss Harper. However, an unmarried woman living in the home of a widowed man, regardless of any stated purpose, creates a situation what?" Evelyn said pleasantly. Mrs. Alderton blinked. She had clearly expected less direct a response. "That is inappropriate by the standards of this community." "Mrs. Alderton, I have a private room with a separate entrance. Mr. Turner and I keep professional hours and a professional arrangement. The work being done here is legitimate and documented." She picked up one of Caleb's writing exercises from the table and held it up briefly. "This is an educational engagement. Nothing more. The town doesn't see it that way," Dolores Hatch said. She was a blunt woman and didn't pretend otherwise. "You already had your reputation damaged by the board decision. Staying out here only makes it worse. We're telling you this for your own benefit. With respect, Mrs. Hatch, the last time this town offered me something for my own benefit, it came with a dismissal letter attached. I've learned to be cautious with that phrase." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Mrs. Crane spoke, and her voice was quieter than the other 2, and something in it made Evelyn look at her more carefully. "My Margaret asks about you," she said. "Every evening she asks if you're coming back." Evelyn held her gaze. "And what do you tell her?" Mrs. Crane's jaw moved. She looked at the floor. "I tell her I don't know." "That is the honest answer," Evelyn said. "I'd encourage you to keep giving it to her. Girls who are told honest answers grow up knowing how to ask honest questions. That's worth something." Mrs. Crane looked up. Something moved through her face, not agreement exactly, but a recognition that cost her something to have. The 3 women left without resolving anything, which was exactly what Evelyn had expected. She went back to the table and picked up where she'd left off, and did not think about the conversation again, until that evening when Caleb came in from the barn, and she told him they'd been there. He stopped in the middle of the room. "What did you tell them?" he asked. "The truth, that our arrangement is professional and legitimate." "And they believed you?" "Probably not. But that's their problem, not mine." She set her pencil down. "It might become yours, though. If the community pressure reaches a point where it affects your business relationships, your contracts, your—" "Miss Harper?" He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "You wrote 3 letters on my behalf this week after yours. Went out one to my cattle buyer in Abilene, one to the county tax office, one to the feed supplier. I've owed a response to since August." He folded his hands on the table. "Before you got here, those letters didn't exist. That cattle buyer was about to give my contract to someone else. The tax office was a week from filing a lien. The feed supplier hasn't threatened anything yet, but he would have." He looked at her steadily. "I am not going to ask you to leave because 3 churchwomen drove out here to be uncomfortable in my front room. Do you understand me?" She held his gaze. Yes, she said. I understand you. Good. He reached across and turned the primer to face him. What are we doing tonight? They did compound words until 9 o'clock, and when the lamp started to dim and she told him they were done for the evening, he pushed back his chair and stood, and said without preamble, You're a good teacher, Miss Harper. I don't say that to be polite. She looked up at him. I know you don't, she said. Thank you. He nodded once and went to his room, and she sat for a while longer, with the lamp burning low and the fire settling into coals, and she thought about Margaret Crane asking for her every evening, and about Rosa Mendez and her gift for mathematics that would almost certainly go untended now, and about all the children Red Hollow had decided didn't merit the same quality of attention as the ones whose fathers could pay for it, and the anger that had nowhere left to go when she'd sat on that train platform 3 weeks ago had, without her entirely noticing, found somewhere to go after all. It had settled into something quieter and more purposeful, the kind of feeling that didn't need to shout because it had already decided. It was Hector who changed everything, and he did it on a Tuesday morning in the second week of December, 6 days before the Abilene lawyer was due to arrive. He came to the door earlier than his usual time, and when Evelyn answered it, she saw immediately that something was wrong. He was holding his hat too tight, and his eyes were doing the careful thing they did when he was calculating what was safe to say. Is Mr. Turner in? He asked. He's at the table. Come in, Hector. He came in. Caleb looked up from the letter he'd been practicing, copying a passage Evelyn had written out for him, 2 sentences about water rights that he was transcribing with increasing fluency and speed. He read Hector's expression the same way she had. Sit down, Caleb said. Hector sat. He turned his hat in his hands. I was in town yesterday evening, he said. At the feed store. There were men talking in the back room. I don't think they knew I was still there. He paused. Mr. Fitch was one of them. The other 2 I didn't know by name, but I know their faces. They work for Fitch, do odd jobs. Caleb set his pencil down very deliberately. What were they saying? Hector looked at Evelyn briefly, then back at Caleb. They were talking about the schoolhouse, about the foundation being... He stopped, chose his words. About how a building with a compromised foundation and old lantern oil stored in the wrong place could go up faster than anyone would expect. The room went absolutely still. Evelyn heard herself breathe. She heard the fire. She heard nothing else. When? Caleb said. His voice had gone to a place she hadn't heard before, not loud, not hard, but stripped of everything except the essential question. I don't know. They stopped talking when they heard something near the door. I left before they saw me. Hector met Caleb's eyes. I came here first thing this morning. Caleb stood up. He moved to the window, stood there for a moment with his back to the room, and when he turned around, his face had that particular stillness she'd come to understand was not calm, but its opposite. A man holding an enormous amount of force perfectly contained, because he knew that releasing it in the wrong direction would destroy something. Why the schoolhouse? Evelyn asked. She heard the steadiness in her own voice and was mildly surprised by it. What does burning an empty building get, Fitch? Caleb looked at her. It's not about the building, he said. It's about who gets blamed for it. He said it slowly, like a man reading aloud from a document he didn't want to believe. They know you're here, Evelyn. The whole county knows. If that building burns, and there's any way to connect it to you, the teacher who was fired for being dangerous. The woman living out at the Turner Ranch stirring up trouble. He stopped. It gives the town a story, a simple story. And simple stories are harder to fight than legal claims. She stared at him. He was right. She knew he was right the moment he said it, because it was exactly the kind of elegant, cowardly construction that had been working against both of them from the beginning. Not a direct attack, but a manufactured narrative, a fire with her name already written in it before the first match was struck. We need to warn the Reverend, she said. Even if Alcott signed that survey, he wouldn't want his church associated with arson. Alcott does what Fitch tells him, Caleb said flatly. Then we warn someone else, the families who still have children using that building. Evelyn. He said her name sharply enough that she stopped. If we wrong person, Fitch knows we know. And if Fitch knows we know, he moves up whatever timeline he has. He looked at Hector. Did they say anything specific? Anytime, any day? Hector shook his head. Just that it needed to happen before the lawyer from Abilene arrived. That was 5 days. The fire happened in 3. It came in the dead of night on a Thursday, and by the time the town bell was ringing, the schoolhouse was already gone. Not damaged, not partially standing, but gone the way a building went when it had been prepared to burn, rather than simply caught by accident. Evelyn heard the bell from her room and was dressed and out the door before Caleb reached the hallway, and they stood in the yard of the ranch and watched the orange light pulse against the bottom of the clouds 4 miles toward town. "The children," she said. "It's 3 in the morning. No children." He was already moving toward the barn. "But we need to ride in. If we're not there, it looks worse." They rode in together, which Evelyn understood as they approached the crowd gathered at the ruins, was a mistake in terms of optics and a necessity in terms of everything else. The fire was out by then, smothered by the volunteer brigade and the December cold, and the simple fact that there was nothing left to sustain it. What remained was a blackened foundation and the smell of burned wood and the sound of people who had been frightened out of their beds and were now looking for somewhere to put the fear. They found Evelyn without any apparent effort. It was Harold Graves who stepped forward, still in his coat over his nightclothes, and pointed at her in front of a crowd of at least 40 people, and said loud enough that no one could pretend not to hear, "This is what comes of harboring a radical. This is what comes of letting a woman like this operate unchecked in our community." The crowd went quiet in the way crowds did when someone had said the thing everyone was thinking, and the thinking of it had now become a public act. Evelyn stood her ground. "I have been 4 miles outside of town for 3 weeks, Mr. Graves. I haven't been near that building since the day you dismissed me." "Your influence," Graves began. "My influence?" she said, and her voice was sharp and clear in the cold night air. "Is the reason Rosa Mendez can multiply fractions, and James Whitfield knows 3 poems by heart, and Margaret Crane believes she has a future worth imagining. If you want to blame your burning building on my influence, you go right ahead. I'll accept that charge with everything I have." Someone in the crowd made a sound that might have been agreement, or might have been something else. It was dark, and she couldn't see who. But Harold Graves heard it too, and the expression on his face changed from righteous to calculating, which was a different and more dangerous thing. "Miss Harper," he said, pulling his coat tighter, "I would advise you to be very careful about the position you're taking right now. And I would advise you," a voice said from directly behind her, quiet and absolute, "to be very careful about the accusation you're making." Caleb Turner stepped forward until he was standing beside her, and the crowd shifted in the way crowds shifted when a variable they hadn't accounted for moved into the equation. Graves looked at him. "Turner, this doesn't concern you." "She's on my property and under my roof," Caleb said. "That makes it concern me." He let a beat of silence fall between them, the kind of silence that men who had spent years in the company of dangerous animals and unpredictable weather knew how to use. "And I'd be very interested to know Harold, who had access to this building after hours, seeing as how this fire burned the way it burned." Graves stiffened. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything," Caleb said. "I'm asking a question. Same question I'll be asking in writing with a lawyer present before the end of this week." He held Graves's gaze without blinking. "You have a good night." He turned without waiting for a response, and Evelyn turned with him, and they walked back through the crowd to where the horses were tied, and nobody stopped them, and nobody called after them, and the silence at their backs was the loudest thing Evelyn had heard in weeks. She didn't say anything until they were mounted and moving back down the road out of town, the orange light of the ruins fading behind them. And then she said very quietly, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said. "It's going to cost you." "I know that too." He rode for a moment in silence. "Did you mean what you said about Rosa and James and Margaret?" She looked at him. Every word. He nodded once and looked back at the road. "Then it was worth the cost," he said. and they rode back to the ranch in the dark with the stars overhead, and the wind cutting cold across the open land. And Evelyn Harper, who had spent 3 weeks believing she was running out of reasons to stay in Texas, found that she had stopped counting them entirely. The lawyer from Abilene arrived on a Friday morning 2 days after the fire in a rented buggy with a leather case that looked like it had traveled a considerable portion of the American Southwest and remembered every mile of it. His name was Edmund Rourke. He was 61 years old, and he had the kind of face that suggested he had heard every variety of human dishonesty and had stopped being surprised by any of them approximately 30 years ago. He read through all of Fitch's correspondence at the kitchen table, while Caleb stood by the window, and Evelyn sat across from Rourke with her own notes laid out beside the originals. Rourke read without comment, occasionally turning a page back to reread something, occasionally making a small mark in the margin of his own notebook. When he finished, he closed the correspondence file and looked at Caleb. "This is aggressive work for a county alderman," he said. "Fitch has been aggressive his whole life," Caleb said. "He's just usually better at hiding it." "What changed?" "My wife died. She handled all the paper business." Caleb said it plainly, with the directness of a man who had decided that the cost of plainness was lower than the cost of anything else. Fitch knew that. He waited the better part of a year and then started building his case. He's been counting on me not being able to read what he was sending. Rourke looked at him without expression. "And can you?" Caleb pulled the primer across the table and opened it to the page he'd been working on the night before, and read the passage aloud without hesitating on more than 2 words. It was not fluent. It was not polished. But it was unmistakable. Rourke watched him and then looked at Evelyn, and she read in his expression a question she didn't answer because it wasn't hers to answer. "The boundary survey from 1887 is the weak point in Fitch's chain," Rourke said. "The witness signatures need to hold legal scrutiny. You mentioned the Reverend's name appears there." "Alcott," Caleb confirmed. "Is Alcott the kind of man who signs things without reading them, or the kind of man who signs things knowing exactly what they say?" Caleb thought about that for a moment. "The second kind," he said. "But he's also the kind of man who, when the weight of what he signed gets heavy enough, starts looking for a way to put it down." Rourke nodded slowly. "I'd like to speak with Alcott before I file anything. A cooperative witness changes the shape of this case considerably." He closed his notebook. "I'll stay through next week if you can accommodate me." "There's a room," Caleb said. Rourke glanced at the papers on the table, at the primer, at Evelyn's neat, organized notes, and then at Caleb with an expression that was not quite approval, but was in the neighborhood of it. "You put together good documentation," he said. "That was Miss Harper," Caleb said. Rourke looked at her. "Whose idea was the letter to Abilene?" "His," she said. Rourke picked up his case. "Then you've both got more sense than most of the clients I see," he said, and went to find the spare room. Fitch made his move that same afternoon. He came to the ranch himself, which surprised Evelyn when she saw the buggy, because it was not the move of a man who was confident. It was the move of a man who had learned something unnerving. The Abilene lawyer, probably someone in town, had seen Rourke arrive and was recalibrating faster than his usual pace. Caleb met him in the yard. Evelyn stood in the doorway of the ranch house and watched. Fitch was a thick man in his 50s, with a beard going silver, and the kind of easy authority that came from having been the largest financial presence in a room for most of his adult life. He climbed down from the buggy without hurrying and straightened his coat and looked at Caleb the way a man looked at a chess piece he was deciding whether to take or sacrifice. "Caleb," he said, "I think we should talk." "We're talking," Caleb said. He did not offer his hand. He did not step forward. He stood where he was with his thumbs hooked in his belt and let Fitch come to him, which was a small thing, but not a meaningless one. "I'm going to be honest with you," Fitch said. "That would be a first," Caleb said pleasantly. Fitch's expression flickered. He adjusted. "The boundary situation has gotten complicated in ways I didn't intend. I think there's a resolution here that works for both of us, without involving outside parties." He named a figure, a purchase price for the northeastern quarter section, that was reasonable by any objective measure, possibly even generous. Caleb looked at him for a moment without speaking. "That land is worth more than that in water rights alone," he said finally. "Know it. Which means this offer is what you're willing to pay to make a lawyer from Abilene go away before he starts asking questions about the survey." He tilted his head slightly. "What questions are you afraid of, Alderman?" Fitch's jaw tightened. The easy authority shifted into something else, something with less patience in it. "I'm trying to handle this reasonably, Caleb. My land isn't for sale," Caleb said. "Not the northeast quarter, not any of it. And the lawyer stays." He looked at Fitch steadily. "You have a good afternoon." Fitch looked past him at the ranch house doorway at Evelyn standing there, and his gaze held on her for just long enough to communicate that he understood exactly what she was to this situation, and had not forgotten what he could still do about it. Then he got back in his buggy and left. Caleb came inside. He sat down at the table and pressed both hands flat on the surface and breathed out slowly. "He's going to push harder now," Evelyn said. "I know." "Are you sure about the land? Because if he escalates—" "I'm sure," Caleb said. He looked up at her. "Clara and I built this ranch with $12 and a borrowed wagon and 4 years of work I don't have words for. That northeast quarter is where she used to ride in the evenings when the light was good." He paused. "It's not for sale." She nodded. She didn't say anything else because there was nothing to add to that. That evening, she was working at the table when she heard him in the room he used as a study, quiet sounds paper moving the occasional pause. She had heard those sounds before and had learned to recognize them as his private practice sessions, the ones he ran himself outside of their formal lessons late at night when he thought she was asleep or occupied. She had never commented on them. She understood that a man needed to own some part of his own progress, but after an hour she heard something different, a stillness that had weight to it. And then his voice low and careful, reading aloud to himself, and she recognized after a moment what he was reading. It was Clara's Bible. She was very quiet for a long time. She kept her eyes on her own work. She heard him read slowly through something. A psalm, she thought, from the cadence of it, and stumble twice and go back and find the words again. And she heard the cost of it, and the determination underneath the cost. And she thought about a man who had turned that book face down on the first night she arrived, because he couldn't bear the reminder of what he couldn't access. And she pressed her hand briefly over her mouth and looked at the ceiling, and told herself very firmly that she was a professional with a professional arrangement and a professional level of composure, and then she went back to her notes. He came out 20 minutes later. He set the Bible on the table. He sat down. "I read the 23rd Psalm," he said. She had it underlined, Clara. He looked at the cover. "First time I ever read it myself, instead of just hearing someone else say it at her funeral." Evelyn put her pencil down. She looked at him directly. "How was it?" she asked. He thought about that for a long moment. "Like hearing something for the first time even though I already knew it," he said. She held his gaze. He held hers. Neither of them looked away, and in the space between them, something shifted quietly into a new position, the way a river shifted after a season of pressure, not dramatic, not sudden, but permanent. And they both felt it, and neither of them named it, because naming it would have required both of them to be ready, and neither of them was entirely ready yet. "Same time tomorrow," he said finally. "Same time tomorrow," she agreed. He went to bed. She sat at the table for a long time with the lamp burning and the Bible where he'd left it, and the sound of Texas wind against the shutters, and she thought about what it meant to watch a person find themselves on the page. Not discover something new about themselves, but recognize something that had always been there, buried under other people's assessments of their worth. It was what she had always loved about teaching, and she had not expected to find it here like this under these circumstances with this particular man. But there it was. Reverend Alcott came on a Wednesday morning, and he came alone, which told Evelyn before he opened his mouth that this was not an official visit. He was a small man with a precise manner and nervous hands, and he stood at the door of the ranch house with his hat in both hands and asked to speak with Mr. Turner privately. And Caleb looked at him for a moment and then said, Anything you need to say to me can be said in front of Miss Harper. She's been managing my correspondence for the better part of a month, and she knows more about my business than anyone." Alcott looked at her. She looked back at him with the expression she used for students who were about to tell her something they'd been holding too long. He came inside. He sat down. He set his hat on his knee. He looked at the table surface as though reading something written there, and then he said, "The survey. The 1887 survey. I signed it as a witness without. I was told it was a routine boundary documentation. I was told there was no dispute. I was told—" He stopped. I knew Fitch was stretching the truth. I told myself it was a small thing, a line on a map. He looked up at Caleb. It was not a small thing. I understand that now. "Why now?" Caleb asked. Alcott reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He laid it on the table. "Because 2 days ago I was looking through the County Education Fund records. I'm on the board as a moral advisor. I have access, and I found something I was not supposed to find." Evelyn leaned forward. "What records?" Alcott looked at her. "The school fund accounts, going back to 1886. He pushed the document toward her. "Fitch has been diverting education funds for years. Small amounts consistently routed through a property management account that doesn't correspond to any county property I can identify. The total over 7 years. He paused. "It's substantial." Evelyn opened the document. Her eyes moved down the columns of figures. She had spent enough time with accounting ledgers in her 3 weeks at the ranch to read this one quickly, and what she read made something cold settle in the center of her chest. "This is why the school never had adequate supplies," she said. She looked up. "This is why the building hadn't been maintained. This is why teachers kept being blamed for a system that was failing because the money meant to run it was being stolen." She looked at Alcott directly. "Did you know, before now?" "No," he said. He said it with the certainty of a man who had been asking himself the same question and was absolutely sure of the answer. "I didn't know, but I knew Fitch used money in ways that didn't bear scrutiny, and I chose not to scrutinize, which is not the same as innocence, and I understand that." Caleb looked at the document and then at Alcott. "Why bring this here?" he said. "Why not take it to the county commissioner?" "Because the county commissioner plays cards with Fitch every Thursday evening," Alcott said flatly. "And because you have a lawyer from Abilene sitting in your spare room, which I believe makes you the most useful destination for this document in the entire county." He stood up and picked up his hat. "I'll testify. If it comes to that, I'll testify to the survey, and I'll testify to finding these records. It won't be comfortable." He looked at Caleb steadily. "I should have spoken up a long time ago. I know that." Caleb looked at him for a long moment. It was the look of a man deciding something about another man, not whether to like him, not whether to forgive him, but whether to trust him enough to be useful. "I'll tell Rourke," he said finally. "Expect a visit." Alcott nodded, put on his hat, and left. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then Evelyn stood up, went to the study doorway, and knocked twice. "Mr. Rourke," she said, "I think you need to come look at something." Rourke came out with his reading glasses still on and looked at the document on the table and read it the way he read everything, without expression, without comment, with the focused efficiency of a man who processed information for a living. When he finished, he looked at Evelyn and then at Caleb. "Where did this come from?" he asked. "The Reverend," Caleb said. "Is he reliable?" "He's scared and ashamed, which in my experience makes a man more reliable than comfortable," Caleb said. "He'll testify." Rourke set the document down. He took his glasses off. He looked at both of them with an expression that for the first time since his arrival contained something that might have been satisfaction. "Then we don't have a land dispute case anymore," he said. "We have a fraud case, and fraud cases have a way of pulling a great many other things into the light alongside them." Evelyn looked at Caleb. He was looking at the document on the table with an expression she was beginning to know, the focused, deliberate face of a man who had spent years being disadvantaged by other people's access to information and had decided he was done with that arrangement permanently. "How long will it take?" he asked Rourke. "To file 3 days. To have Fitch responding to a court summons." Rourke considered. A week, perhaps 10 days, if he lawyers up quickly, which he will. He paused. But I want to address something before we proceed. On diversion, this affects the entire community. The families whose children were deprived of properly funded education. The teachers who were blamed for failures they didn't cause. He looked at Evelyn. Including dismissed teachers who might have legal grounds for wrongful termination if the board was operating under fraudulent financial pretenses. Evelyn stared at him. She hadn't considered it. She hadn't let herself consider it the same way she hadn't let herself consider certain other things that were becoming increasingly difficult not to consider, including the fact that she had stopped thinking of the Turner Ranch as a temporary arrangement sometime in the last 2 weeks without clearly registering when. One thing at a time, she said. Rourke shrugged. Of course, but the options exist. He picked up his notebook. I'll draft the filing tonight. He went back to the study. Caleb looked at her. Wrongful termination, he said. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of a man turning a new piece of information over in his hands, examining its weight. I said one thing at a time, she said. You did. He was quiet for a moment. Evelyn. She looked at him. He only used her given name when something mattered enough that formality would have been a kind of dishonesty. Whatever happens with Fitch, he said, whatever happens with Rourke and the courts and all of it, I want you to know that what you did here, coming here, the letters and the lessons, and everything with Rourke that mattered, regardless of how the rest of it goes. He paused. I needed you to know that. She looked at him for a long, steady moment. I know, she said quietly. And for what it's worth, Caleb, so did I. Neither of them spoke again for a while, but the silence between them had changed character entirely from the silence of that first wagon ride out of Red Hollow, and they both knew it, and neither of them was inclined to disturb what had settled there by saying anything further about it. The filing went out the following morning, and by the afternoon of that same day, something remarkable had begun to happen in Red Hollow, Texas, the kind of thing that happens when a truth too large to contain finally finds the crack in the wall it has been pressing against. People started talking. But this time, they were not talking about Evelyn Harper. They were talking about Alderman Fitch and the Education Fund, and the years of books that didn't arrive, and roofs that didn't get repaired, and teachers who got blamed for a system that had been quietly hollowed out from the inside, while the man responsible sat in the front pew at church every Sunday morning and told the town it was doing fine. Mrs. Crane arrived at the ranch on Thursday evening just before dark. She knocked, and when Evelyn answered the door, she held out a basket with bread and preserves and said without preamble, Margaret wants to know if you'll teach her again. Privately, if the school isn't, if there isn't. She stopped. She pressed her lips together. I should have spoken up at the board meeting, she said. I want you to know I know that. Evelyn looked at her for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door. Come in, Mrs. Crane, she said. I'll put on coffee. The county hearing was scheduled for the second Tuesday of January, and the night before it. Caleb Turner sat at the kitchen table until nearly midnight, writing something that was not a legal document, and not a lesson exercise, and not a letter to any lawyer or county official. He wrote slowly with the deliberate care of a man for whom each word was still a small act of will. And when Evelyn came out at 11:30 to refill the lamp oil, she saw what he was doing and quietly refilled it without comment, and went back to her room and lay awake for a long time, listening to the sound of the pencil moving across the page. She told herself she was thinking about the hearing. She was not entirely thinking about the hearing. The hearing room in the county courthouse was not large, but it was full by 8 in the morning, fuller than Rourke had expected. He admitted quietly to Evelyn, as they took their seats, fuller than a routine fraud proceeding had any business being. But then, this was not a routine proceeding, and Red Hollow was not a town that had ever managed to be indifferent to its own business. And word had traveled the way. Word traveled in small places through back doors and kitchen tables and conversations, held in low voices that somehow reached everyone regardless. Fitch arrived with 2 lawyers from Dallas, which told the room everything it needed to know about how seriously he was taking the filing. He didn't look at Caleb when he entered. He didn't look at Evelyn. He sat down at his table and talked to his lawyers in a voice too low to carry, and kept his face arranged in the expression of a man who had been unfairly put upon and was managing his patients admirably. Rourke laid out the case in 62 minutes. He was not dramatic about it. He did not need to be. The documents made the argument, the diverted education funds, the manipulated survey, the sequence of legal filings timed to exploit a man's inability to read his own correspondence, and he presented them in the flat, precise language of someone who understood that facts of this quality required no embellishment. Alcott testified for 22 minutes. His voice shook twice. He did not retreat from a single word. When Fitch's lawyers attempted to characterize the boundary survey as a routine administrative matter, with no fraudulent intent, Rourke produced Hector's written account of the feed store conversation, the one about compromised foundations and lantern oil, and the room made a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite silence, but something between the two. The county judge was a man named Harlan Cole, who had been on the bench for 18 years and had the manner of someone who had heard every variety of human justification and had developed a constitutional immunity to being impressed by any of it. He looked at the evidence. He looked at Fitch. He looked at his lawyers. And then he said in the level tone of a man announcing the weather, "I'm going to need significantly more convincing than I'm currently receiving that any part of this documentation is in dispute." Fitch's lead lawyer leaned in and said something close to his ear. Fitch looked at the table. The hearing recessed for 40 minutes, and when it resumed, Fitch's legal team made a proposal full restitution of the diverted school funds, surrender of the boundary claim against the Turner property, and a financial settlement to be negotiated with the County Education Board. No admission of criminal wrongdoing, which Rourke told Caleb privately he had expected, and which would be contested separately, in a proceeding that would take longer and yield a result that was less certain. "Take the settlement for now," Rourke said quietly. "The land is protected. The school funds come back. The rest we build toward." Caleb looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him and said, "The children need the money now, not in 2 years when a criminal proceeding resolves." He nodded. "Take it," he told Rourke. When the hearing concluded and people began filing out of the room, Harold Graves found his way through the crowd to where Evelyn was gathering her documents from the table. He stood for a moment without speaking, which was an unusual state for Harold Graves, and she let him be in it without rescuing him from the discomfort. Finally, he said, "The board made a decision based on incomplete information and pressure from Fitch that I should have questioned more rigorously than I did." He paused. "That's the most accurate thing I can say about it." "It is accurate," she agreed. "I'm not asking you to." He stopped. "I don't expect anything from you, Miss Harper. I just needed to say it to your face." She studied him. He was not a good man. She didn't think the evidence supported that conclusion, but he was a man who understood that he had done something that required acknowledgement, and he was acknowledging it without negotiating the terms of the acknowledgement, which was something. "Thank you for saying it, Mr. Graves," she said. And she meant it in the precise and limited way that it deserved to be meant. She turned back to her documents, and that was the end of it. The barn school was Caleb's idea. She had floated the concept carefully, watching his face ready to walk it back if it landed wrong, and he'd listened to the whole thing. The cleared south section of the barn, the desks he could build, the families she believed would come if she asked them. And when she finished, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "When do we start?" They spent 3 days preparing the space. Caleb built 4 desks himself, and Walt built 2 more, and Hector brought 2 benches from his own home, and Evelyn organized the materials she'd managed to retrieve from her classroom before the dismissal. The primer 2 arithmetic texts, a grammar book, her own annotated teaching notes that she had packed in the bottom of her trunk on the morning she thought she was leaving forever. She sent word to the families she knew. Not a general announcement, not a posting on the town board personal word delivered through Hector and through Mrs. Crane, and through the quiet network of people who had always known what Red Hollow was and had been waiting without much expectation for something different. The first morning, 3 children arrived. Rosa Mendez, who was 12 now, and had grown 2 inches since September came with her father and her younger brother, who was 7, and had never been inside a classroom. Rosa walked through the barn door and looked at the desks and looked at Evelyn, and her face did something complicated and young and overwhelmed, and Evelyn crossed the room and put both hands and said, "Sit wherever you like, Rosa. You're home." Rosa sat in the front row. Her father shook Caleb's hand at the door for a long time without speaking. By the second week, 10 children were coming. By the end of January 23, word traveled in the particular way that good things traveled in small communities, slowly at first, and then all at once, family by family. The ones who had been watching and waiting to see whether this was real before committing to it, and then the ones who had been watching the watchers and drawing their own conclusions. Families came from 4 miles away. Then 8. Then one family arrived who had traveled from a neighboring county entirely because someone at a feed store had mentioned it to someone else in passing. Margaret Crane came on the 3rd Tuesday with her mother behind her and a composition book under her arm that she had apparently been using to practice her own writing exercises in the absence of formal instruction. When Evelyn looked at what she'd been doing, the careful, self-directed work of a girl who refused to stop learning, even when the institution responsible for her learning had been taken away. She had to breathe through her nose for a moment before she could trust her voice. "This is excellent, Margaret," she said. "I knew you'd come back," Margaret said. "I told Mama." "You were right," Evelyn said, and meant it in every way available. Caleb sat in on lessons when he could manage it, not at a student desk, not with a primer in front of him, but standing at the back of the space with his arms folded across his chest. Watching the room the way a man watched something he'd built take the weight he'd designed it for. Sometimes the younger children asked him questions. He answered them directly and without talking down to them. And Evelyn watched his face when he did it, the quiet attention he gave each child, the way he listened to their answers with the same careful focus he brought to everything, and she thought about what he'd said on that first wagon ride. That the woman they were afraid of was the one who was doing something real. It was on a Thursday evening in late February, after the children had gone and the barn was quiet, and she was organizing the next day's materials, that she found the envelope on her work table. It was sealed. Her name was on the front in handwriting. She recognized, careful, deliberate, each letter correctly formed and properly spaced, the hand of a man who had worked very hard to say something worth reading. She looked at it for a moment. Then she sat down and opened it. He had written 3 pages. The handwriting was not elegant, and there were 2 words crossed out and restarted, and 1 sentence where she could see he'd paused mid-thought and found his way back into it all, of which made it more readable than any polished document she'd ever handled, because the stops and the restarts were where the truth was. He wrote about Clara first, not about losing her, but about the years they'd had, and about the quality of loneliness that came after, the kind that was different from simple aloneness, because it contained the memory of what had been there before. He wrote about the night at the train station, and what he'd been thinking when he walked onto that platform, and what it had cost him to ask for what he needed, and about the month since, and what they had changed. He wrote, "I am not a man who says things easily. I think you know that. But I have been learning this year that the things worth saying are exactly the things that cost the most to say. And a man who keeps holding them back because they're expensive is a man who ends up poor in every way that matters. So I am writing this down, which is the only way I know to say something in a way I can trust." He wrote, "I would like you to stay, not as a teacher and not as a professional arrangement, as my wife if you are willing, and as the person I would like to spend the rest of my life being honest with." He wrote, "I know I am not an easy man, and I know what this life is. I know what this land is. I am not asking you to choose it because you have nowhere else to go. I am asking you because you are the most remarkable person I have ever met, and because I want to be worthy of that, and because I believe that we have already built something here that is more solid than most people find in a lifetime." He wrote, "I have spelled every word in this letter correctly. I checked." She put the letter down on the table and pressed both hands over her face and sat there for a while in the quiet of the barn with the sound of Texas wind outside and the smell of wood and chalk and the 23 children who had been here today, and who would be here tomorrow. And she cried, not the contained 3-minute crying of that first day, but the kind that came from deep down, from the place where things had been held too long and had finally found the exit. She heard him come in. She heard him stop. She heard him make a small, involuntary sound that was the closest thing to distress she had ever heard from him. Evelyn. His voice was tight. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, if I've made you uncomfortable. Caleb, she said. I can take the letter back, it doesn't have to. Caleb. She lowered her hands. She looked at him across the barn, at this man who had roped steers at 12 and built a house by hand at 22, and buried his wife and child on the same day at 31, and taught himself to read in his 40s, because he was too stubborn and too honest and too fundamentally determined to let shame win, and she said, you spelled every word correctly. He stared at her. I checked, she said. Not one error in 3 pages. The tightness in his face loosened degree by degree, into something she had not seen there before. Open and unguarded and young, in a way that had nothing to do with age, the face of a man who had stopped bracing for impact because the impact had not come. Does that mean yes? He asked. It means yes, she said. He crossed the barn in 4 strides, and she stood up, and they met in the middle of it, and she put her hand against the side of his face. And he held on to her, like a man who had been standing alone in open country for a very long time, and had finally found something solid enough to hold. They were married in April beneath the large oak at the east edge of the ranch with Hector and Walt as witnesses, and Rourke, who had stayed longer than planned, and seemed to feel no urgency about returning to Abilene, standing at the back with his hands folded. Mrs. Crane came with Margaret. Rosa Mendez came with her father and her brother. Reverend Alcott, who had not been asked, but who arrived with his hat in his hands and stood at a respectful distance, was invited forward by Caleb without ceremony, because Caleb Turner was not a man who dealt in grudges, when the person who had wronged him had since chosen differently. 15 of the Barnes School students came. They stood in a crooked line along the fence and watched with the solemn attention of children witnessing something they understood mattered, even if they couldn't yet articulate exactly why. Some people from town came too. Not the ones who had been loudest against her. They stayed away, which was honest of them. But the ones who had been quiet, the ones who had looked at the floor at the school board meeting and crossed the street when they passed her at the train station and said nothing, when nothing would have been the easier choice. They came and they stood at the edge of the gathering and they watched, and Evelyn did not keep a record of who they were or what it had cost them to be there, because that kind of accounting produced nothing useful. What she kept instead was the memory of Caleb's face when he said what he had to say to her under that oak tree, simply without performance, in the same unhurried voice he used for everything that mattered, and the memory of looking out at the crooked line of children along the fence and thinking that every single one of them was watching a man and a woman choose each other openly in front of witnesses, and that this was also a lesson. Perhaps the most important one she'd ever taught. The Barnes School ran for 7 years before a proper building was funded in part by the recovered education monies that Fitch's settlement had returned to the county, a fact that gave Evelyn a satisfaction she considered entirely justified. The building was simple and solid, and had Caleb's workmanship in every wall, and on the day it opened, he stood in the doorway and watched children file in and said nothing, because some things were beyond what he needed words for. He read novels by then. History mostly, and agricultural texts, and the occasional newspaper editorial that made him put the paper down and argue with the room. He wrote his own contracts and his own correspondence, and handled his own legal business with a directness that had caused more than one county official to underestimate him once, and not repeat the mistake. He still had the leather journal he'd started during those first months with Evelyn, the one where he'd practiced his letters and his sentences, and had written in increasingly steady handwriting things he couldn't have said aloud, and it sat on the shelf beside Clara's Bible. Both of them evidence of the same truth, that the things a person carries quietly for years in shame or in grief do not have to stay the weight they started. Rosa Mendez grew up to be a mathematics teacher. Margaret Crane became a doctor, the first woman in that county to do so. And when she opened her practice, she hung a single framed note on the wall that read in handwriting, Evelyn recognized as her own from 30 years prior. You are capable of more than they have told you. When people asked Caleb Turner in his later years what had changed his life, he always gave the same answer. He said a woman refused to get on a train, and then he told the whole story from the beginning because he had learned half of his life what he hadn't known in the first. That stories were how people found each other across time, how the living passed something real to the ones who came after, how a thing that happened in a barn in Texas in the winter of 1892 could still be teaching someone something in a world those two people never got to see. Evelyn Harper Turner was 71 years old when she died, surrounded by former students whose own children were sitting in the chairs along the wall of the room, and the last thing she said clearly, without drama, with the same precise directness she had brought to every classroom and every argument and every moment of her life that had required her to hold her ground, was I did not waste a single day. She had not, and neither had he. And the town of Red Hollow, Texas, which had once handed a woman a dismissal letter and called it justice, learned eventually the slow, humbling way that towns learn things that the most dangerous person they had ever run off their land had turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to them. That is the only ending this story was ever going to have. Because when a woman refuses to stay broken, and a man refuses to stay silent, the world does not stay the same. It never does. It never will.